Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Socrates in the City in Oxford. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Please, stay in your seats, please. Thank you for coming. You're a studio audience, obviously. We're televising this. Really thrilled to be doing this in Oxford, doing a number of these. We've done a few around the United States, but never abroad. So thank you for allowing us to test this out on you. So far, it's been going tremendously well. Actually, this has been a low point, if I can say that. It's gone so well that this is the nadir of the experience so far, and I blame you. We enjoy Socrates in the City. It's called Socrates in the City because Socrates famously said the unexamined life is not worth living. And we think that, yes, it's true that we don't, in modern culture, examine our lives and think about the big questions. So the idea of Socrates in the City is simply to ask whatever big questions we can ask and to try to talk about the big things. So we call it a conversation about life, God, and other small topics. Hold your applause, please. So we talk about all kinds of different things, but we tend to talk about the big questions. I want to thank the folks who made this possible. We have a number of patrons who have made it possible for us to have these crews here, to get here, to be here this week. I want to thank Lisa and Kenny Trout of Dallas, Susie and Jerry Wilson, also of Dallas, Laura and David Thayer of Philadelphia, and our friend Sharon Vanderpaul of Grand Rapids, who is actually in the room, although I won't point her out because she's easily embarrassed right there. Thank you, honestly, thank you, because we wouldn't be able to do it, so thank you for sponsoring this. Well, it falls to me now to introduce our very distinguished guest for this evening at Socrates in the City. Dr. Michael Ward is our guest. You may know of him. In case you don't, I'll tell you a few things. He's a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall here at the University of Oxford. Perhaps most significantly for us this evening, he's the author of an absolutely smashing, groundbreaking book called Planet Narnia. There's no hyperbole in that. Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. He's also co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, and he's the presenter of the BBC TV documentary, The Narnia Code, which is sort of a popular version of the book, Planet Narnia. On the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, which was just the 22nd of November of 2013, Dr. Ward unveiled a permanent memorial to C.S. Lewis in Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey. Perhaps you've heard of the Abbey? Very good, excellent. Although he's based at Blackfriars here in Oxford, he's also a professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University in Texas. You didn't see that coming, did you? Did you? As an Anglican clergyman, he served as chaplain of St. Peter's College in the University of Oxford from 2009 to 2012, and as chaplain of Peterhouse in the University of Cambridge between 2004 and 2007. He was resident warden of the Kilns. Some of you know about the Kilns, and some of us are going on a tour of the Kilns, I think tomorrow. That's C.S. Lewis's Oxford home. He studied English, not Lewis, but Dr. Ward, here at Oxford. He studied theology at Cambridge, and he has a PhD in divinity from St. Andrews. Although, and I have to say this, according to Dr. Ward, his chief claim to fame, listen carefully because we're not making this up, his chief claim to fame is that he handed a pair of X-ray spectacles to James Bond in the movie The World Is Not Enough. Now you're interested, aren't you? I know. Before Dr. Ward, was somebody applauding James Bond? Whoever that was, get out. Whatever Dr. Ward's accomplishments, I just want to dilate for a moment here on this book, The Narnia Code, or rather Planet Narnia, and the subsequent popular version of it called The Narnia Code, and the BBC documentary, The Narnia Code. I want to say this while he's not on the stage, because he may blush, because I get fulsome in my praise. But it's an extraordinary thing, this book, absolutely extraordinary. When I heard about this, I almost couldn't believe it. The background is, Lewis's 7 books, the Narnia books, for years, many Lewis scholars said, knowing Lewis, there's a reason that he wrote 7, but we don't know what it is. and they tried to figure it out. People would write papers, and they say, oh, it's the 7 sacraments, each one corresponds to this, or each one... None of them really made sense. But imagine roughly 60 years going by since he wrote them, 50 since his death, decades, C.S. Lewis scholars poring over these works, never coming up with the answer. And then, of course, you conclude, well, that's because there is no answer, right? Well, as you'll hear in a few minutes, Michael Ward outrageously discovered the hidden code in these books, which Lewis never revealed. This is crazy stuff. It's amazing stuff. I call it, without hyperbole, the literary discovery of the century, the 16th century, by the way. Thank you. But honestly, it's truly amazing. And so many people I know who love Lewis don't know anything about this. Trust me, this is astounding, absolutely astounding. So anything I can do to get word out about this, I do. And since we're here in Oxford, it was my joy to find out that Dr. Ward was able to be with us. He's here in the room now. How about a warm Socrates in the City, Oxford welcome for Dr. Michael Ward. Dr. Ward. Welcome, welcome. Wow. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but I summed it up, so you've been a great audience. Thank you. Well, where do we begin, sir? I think, first of all, we ask you, what in the world led you to this discovery? I mean, we'll talk about the discovery, but what was it that led you to the discovery? Where were you in life? When was it? Tell us what you can of the story.
Well, I think it probably is best to go back to the beginning and start with the fact that the Narnia books were read aloud to me by my parents when I was growing up. And that introduced me to the series and engendered in me a great enthusiasm for them. I loved them as stories.
Read aloud to you. That is wonderful.
Yes.
It must be a wonderful parent who would read the Narnia books aloud to their child.
My 2 brothers and I would jump into our parents' bed on a Sunday morning, and my mum would read a chapter aloud to us before we went off to church.
I only say that your parents must be extremely wonderful for doing that because I did that with my daughter. I believe my daughter's here. Did she just run out of the room? But I did do that, and I just thought, oh, these books are so great, because it's not every book that one wants to read aloud as a parent. No. But those books are great. Okay, so very early on, you cut your teeth, so to speak, on Narnia. And
I was intrigued by them particularly because my parents just led me a little bit to realize that there was a kind of second level of meaning going on in the books.
Your parents? I have not heard this.
They said to me that, you know, Aslan is a little bit like Jesus, and the White Witch is a little bit like the devil. You know, it was no more than that. But that was enough to make me think of the Narnia books as different from other books, because other books didn't seem to have those 2 levels.
Right.
So I was pleased by that. And that led me on to read Lewis's other fiction when I was older, and I went through his Christian apologetics in my teens. Then I came here to Oxford to study English and began looking at Lewis's academic works. And then, when it came time for me to do my PhD, the obvious choice was C.S. Lewis, because I was already fairly expert in his writings.
Well, now, hang on a second, whereas you Brits say, hang on a tick.
Hang on a mo.
Hang on a moment, why don't you? Maybe I missed something here. You studied English here.
Yes.
Or you read English.
I read English.
Pardon me, for being American. You read English here. When was it that you found yourself wanting to do Lewis academically? Was it as an undergraduate?
It was, yeah. That was when I first began to study him seriously. I did an undergraduate thesis actually on the Narnia books here as part of my English degree. So that was the first time I considered them sort of academically. Yeah. And then I began to teach. I began to tutor and lecture on Lewis even before I began my PhD. Yeah.
Okay.
And I lived for 3 years in his house.
You lived for 3 years in the Kilns. We're going to visit tomorrow. You're welcome to join us. But I have to say that it's an extraordinary thing that they've preserved the house, or they've done more than preserve it. They've refurbished it, and they have beautiful aluminum siding, just as Lewis would have had if he had lived. Yes. So yes, he would have become a Catholic, and aluminum siding would be on the house. I'm telling you, if he had lived, I know. Walter Hooper's going to confirm this tomorrow. But so you lived in the house. So you clearly, you really had a deep connection and long-standing connection with Lewis.
I did. And it was a great privilege in those 3 years living at the Kilns actually to have his bedroom as my bedroom and his study as my study. There was one particularly interesting moment. I was sitting in his study one day and I was listening to the BBC radio broadcasting an adaptation of one of the Narnia books, The Silver Chair.
It's getting a little freaky.
Well, I was sitting in this room and I was enjoying this radio adaptation, and then it occurred to me, this story was probably written in this room. And here it is being beamed back into the room. It goes out into the world, becomes famous, becomes a radio play, and gets beamed back into the room, and the circle is completed. And here I am listening to it.
I'm surprised you didn't disappear with an audible pop.
Yes.
Right? So then you get your PhD from
St Andrews.
From St Andrews in Lewis studies?
Yeah, I was looking at, well, I began by studying his understanding of the Word. That was my sort of provisional title. And I was going to look at his understanding of Christ, the divine Word, Scripture, the written Word of God, and human language. And that gave me Christ, Scripture, language, CSL, which I thought was really clever. But I'm so glad that halfway through this research, I stumbled across this Narnia thing, because...
Okay. So you were in your room. I remember this now. You were in your room.
Yeah, that provisional project was vastly, unmanageable, and I would never have completed that PhD.
I was going to say, even listening to it, I think it's a nice idea, but then you have to do it.
Yeah, quite. But 18 months into the research, I was lying in bed one night, reading a poem that Lewis wrote about the planets.
Okay, and that's titled The Planets.
The poem is simply The Planets.
And the amazing thing about Lewis, too, is that he wrote glorious poems. I mean, his talent is so outrageous that he was able to write in these different genres, and he wrote many beautiful, amazing poems. My favorite is what the bird said early in the year. I just think that if he'd done nothing else in his life... But so you were reading The Planets.
I was. This is a poem that he wrote 15 years before Narnia. It's in a very complicated alliterative meter, and it's all about the seven heavens of the medieval cosmos, which, of course, Lewis, as a medievalist, knew all about.
Okay, now, I think probably you should say what that is, because...
Yeah, the medieval cosmos.
Okay, so but this poem was about the 7 planets. Now, you have to hear this. The 7 planets of the medieval cosmos. You say 7? Yes.
The 7 planets of the medieval cosmos, which were the moon and the sun. They were regarded as planets. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn.
Right. This is because in the medieval time, they could see those 7 objects with the naked eye.
Yeah. So this is before the invention of the telescope. This goes back to time immemorial. This is, of course, before the discovery of Uranus or Neptune or Pluto. These are the 7 traditional heavens, which in fact give us the names of the days of the week.
Now, how far back does that cosmology go? Because obviously, if you can see with the naked eye, you assume that people could see these 7 planets before the Middle Ages. Were the ancient Greeks aware of these 7 planets?
Yeah. The ancient Babylonians,
Okay, so it goes way back. But Lewis was a medieval scholar, so he wrote a poem about...
He did, because as the generations went by, as the centuries passed, these 7 objects in the sky became associated with all sorts of qualities and attributes and characteristics and influences.
This is where I get excited, because I'm assuming that most of us don't know anything about this, and that's why when I discovered this, I thought this is so rich and so amazing because no one knows anything about it. So you have to be Michael Ward, a C.S. Lewis scholar, that you know just enough so that when you're reading this poem, something comes alive. And this idea that each of these 7 planets, it wasn't just 7 planets. Each of them had a sort of a whole poetic life.
That's right, a whole poetic set of qualities and symbolic attributes. And indeed, it was thought influences. That they would shed upon the earth. And
so give us an example of 1 or 2 so that...
Okay, well, the moon is a famous example because the moon is associated principally with lunacy. So
right,
lunar makes you a lunatic.
Right, lunacy.
So when the moon is bright and full, people go mad. And why is the moon associated with madness? Because, mostly I think, because the moon is very changeable. You know, the moon waxes and wanes. The moon moves about very quickly. The moon sometimes changes color. It sometimes looks red. It sometimes looks blue. It's sometimes huge. It's sometimes small. So all this sort of variety and changeableness in the moon began to be associated with people's changeable mental states.
Right.
So a lunatic is under the influence of Luna.
Right.
And likewise, if you're particularly martial, strong, manly, then you're under the influence of Mars, the god of war.
Right. And again, you think Mars, martial, right? The idea of, I love these etymological connections because most people today, if they're not English majors or Lewis scholars, they don't think about Mars, martial, right? Martial arts. You don't think that martial arts comes from Mars, that the idea anything military or combative is under the influence of the planet Mars, the red planet. Venus, obviously the planet of love, feminine, love.
And there's a good etymology there, because to venerate is to lovingly respect someone, and that's a Venus influence.
I didn't know that.
A venereal disease is something you contract under the influence of Venus.
This is a family show, so please, enough. This guy's always going on about STDs. Any chance he gets, he just works it around to, please, all right? But honestly, so this is so fascinating because most people don't even know that.
No.
Lewis not only knew it, but he knew it very well. He's a medievalist. He lives in this. He's steeped in this seven-planet cosmology. He's thinking about Jupiter, Jove, jovial. He's thinking of Saturn, Saturnine. He's thinking, and there's so much more to each one of them. Mercury, to be mercurial. And obviously when you think of Mercury, the actual element,
Quicksilver, yeah.
It is itself mercurial, and so there's so much here. Okay, so this is the background.
Yep. And it's not just a medieval thing either. Of course, it has roots in classical literature, classical mythology too, which Lewis equally was well steeped in. So he's writing this poem about the planets, and he's giving you a very poetic, beautiful description of each of the seven heavens, going out from Earth all the way up to heaven itself, God's home, which is outside their created order altogether. And I get to these lines about Jupiter, and one of the things that Jupiter is said to bring about is this: winter past and guilt forgiven. That's a jovial influence.
Okay, so we'll say this again. So we're talking about Jupiter. You're reading the planets, and he says that Jupiter,
symbolically speaking,
one
of the things he's associated with is winter past and guilt forgiven.
Okay, and in American, that would be winter past and guilt forgiven. And it hits you, it strikes you.
Yes, just those 5 words, winter past and guilt forgiven. Because I'm immediately put in mind of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is all about a magical kingdom where there's a 100-year winter, an accursed winter brought about by the White Witch. She's made it always winter, but never Christmas. And her winter passes at the coming of the king of Narnia, who's this lion called Aslan. So the passing of winter is a central symbolic shift of the first Narnia book. And it's also largely about the forgiving of guilt, this story. Because one of the children, Edmund, he's betrayed his brother and his sisters. He's guilty, he's entrapped by the White Witch, she's going to make him her slave, she's threatening to cut his throat, and suddenly he's rescued and he's forgiven. So I think winter past and guilt forgiven is a kind of effective 5-word summary of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So I look more closely at these lines about Jupiter in the poem.
Yeah.
And the more I look, the more Jupiter symbolism seems to account for the whole of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
What additionally is going through your mind? Are you allowing yourself to move in the direction that I wonder if this is a code to these books?
Yeah, because as soon as I see this connection between Jupiter and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I then think, my mind slowly grinding, there are another 6 planets and there are another 6 books. Is it possible that they all correspond in this beautifully neat way? And it was very easy to see that they did.
Very easy for you, obviously, because you're very familiar with the books.
Yes.
Yeah. But this is what's so delicious to me about this, is that I read the planets. It didn't occur to me.
No.
Many people have read the planets. You have to be a certain kind of person to appreciate this, and you were just teed up perfectly to be able to get it.
Well, I myself had read that poem many times before. without making the same connection. So you're quite right. I was teed up. I was in just the right angle at just the right time of day.
That's the St. Andrews reference, teed up.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think the home of golf, yes. And it was hole in one. Ba-dum, boom.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it really was, because I cannot imagine what it felt like to have this begin to dawn on you. I mean, tell us if you can. What in the world is going through your mind? Because this is, I mean, I've said this is the greatest literary discovery of, I mean, it is. The idea that this was hidden from the world, that Lewis, and we have to talk about this, but the fact that Lewis did not reveal this, he didn't give the clue to a friend, or he said nothing. And all these years later, you're in bed reading this poem, and you think,
got it.
Oh my goodness,
yeah.
I think I got it.
Yeah.
What is going through your mind? I mean, when did you get to sleep?
Well, I ought to explain a little bit more about why this thought occurred to me. And it was in no small part because I had been perplexed by the Narnia Chronicles for at least since my undergraduate dissertation, when I was reading the books carefully and closely. I was paying attention to them from a kind of scholarly point of view, literary, critical point of view, and I was beginning to think to myself, these books are very disparate. There doesn't seem to be a uniform pattern or an obvious coherent design.
This is a great point, because many people have noticed that. I mean, I've noticed that. They feel they're similar and not similar. It's strange, and it's not just because they're about different things. They sort of feel slightly different.
Yes.
Typically when one reads a series,
yeah.
they are absolutely of one piece.
Yeah. You read Harry Potter,
yes.
and all 7 books seem to fit pretty well into the same sort of form and expectation.
Yeah. That's true of all series, but it's not really true of the Narnia books.
So that was what first kind of tipped me off to the possibility that there might be more going on here than meets the eye, and I began to be aware that people had suggested these theories.
But you didn't just think that was sloppiness on Lewis's part. In other words, when I say that, that's not really meant to be an insult, but the point is that to write these 7 great books, they are great books. So, you know, normally I would just think, just give the man some grace. Yeah. So what if they're sort of different or they feel slightly disjointed? Each book stands on its own. There's you know, what about it? I mean, who cares?
Yeah. And that basically was my conclusion, because I couldn't find an obvious answer. So the next most obvious explanation is that, you know, Lewis was just kicking back and having fun, and I shouldn't take this too seriously, and the books are just for children anyway, aren't they? And who cares? Why does it matter?
Right.
Let him have some fun. But the more I began to explore Lewis, the less likely that explanation looked.
And why do you say that?
Well, go back to the Planet's poem, for instance. Lewis's poetry is fantastically complex. I mean, mind-bogglingly complex. You look at some of Lewis's poems and you think you've worked out the meter and the rhyme scheme. Then you look a bit more closely and there's a whole other level of complexity.
See, I've actually never heard that. That's interesting to me, because I mean, it's hard for us to understand what an amazing mind he had. He had an absolutely unique...
Rolls-Royce mind.
Yeah, well, even better. I mean, because there are a number of Rolls-Royces out there. He really was... It's one of those minds that... It's a little bit like Shakespeare. It's an absolute outlier. I mean, Shakespeare and Lewis both, in a way, created a literature. They didn't just create books. They created a literature that's... It seems to be more than what you get from other great authors. There's something about Lewis that... And so when you tell me that there's an extra layer to these poems, I think, wow, you know, and who is he doing that for? On some level, he was so brilliant. He's sort of just doing this for himself. It's how his mind worked. Yeah. But I don't know that people have studied those poems and gotten this out of them. Or,
yeah, you know, he's doing it partly for himself. He says somewhere that, you know, he was enamored of metrical and phonetic subtleties, and the poems which look as if they're in free verse are often in the most complicated meters of all.
I just think he's showing off is what he's doing.
But actually, it's also a testimony to his humility, because one of the reasons he's doing it is as an homage, in the literary tradition of those medieval writers whom he so much admired, because Dante and Chaucer and Spenser and Milton, as Lewis also points out, love to present us with something which can't be taken in at a glance. Everything leads to everything else in these writers, he says, but often by very intricate paths, and complexity is a mark of the medieval mind. Oh. So as a medieval scholar himself, he wants to imitate that. It's not just that he's showing off, although there may be an element of that, it's that he wants to imitate his heroes.
Well, I think it's the fact that he's so bright that he can imitate his heroes. I mean, anybody tries to imitate Dante or Spenser, it's not going to be that easy. You have to be a genius on the level of Dante or Spenser, which he happened to be.
That's one example of his love of complexity and intricacy and multi-layering, just his own poetry. Then, as a literary scholar himself, he loved studying these medieval writers who themselves love all these different layers and different perspectives working simultaneously in the same work. And then as a Christian, Lewis had very profound beliefs about the universe itself, that God, the supreme artist, the supreme author, has made every single thing in creation for both its own particular individual purpose and for interdependent purposes with every other created thing. So we are important as individuals and we are important as communities. And even seemingly random things have been made for a purpose. We may not be able to work out what that is, but it exists in the mind of God. So in his book on prayer, Lewis says, down to the curve of every wave and the flight of every insect, God is working his purposes out. So that shows you, as a Christian, he believes in minute detail.
Right, but it does make sense. If you're talking about the God of the universe, not Zeus. Zeus could not pull this off. 1,000 Zeuses could not pull this off.
No.
But the God of the universe, who is in charge of the path of every electron in the universe now and forever, could pull this off.
Yes.
And I've actually had that thought. You're looking at the waves and you're wondering, is God aware of the path of the waves? And you begin realizing, well, that's nothing for him. And of course he is. And if he is, what else is behind it? And that levels of meaning, it's almost frightening. In other words, when you get a glimpse of how big and amazing God is, it's frightening because it is so much bigger than we are. And you really can't take it in. But somebody like Lewis could take it in a little bit more than your average bear.
And he says somewhere that, you remember Dunkirk, this the famous retreat during the Second World War, when the British Army came back safely from Dunkirk, and the weather was gloriously warm and sunny, so that they were able to retreat safely. And people said, this is providential, this is God's purpose working itself out. And Lewis says, the fine weather at Dunkirk was no more part of God's creative act than is each particle in the ring of Saturn.
Well, that's true and not true, isn't it? And it's like saying that it's like saying the parting of the Red Sea is not a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, he's not saying that in order to discredit the importance of the weather.
But he's giving us perspective that
even the particles of dust in the rings of Saturn are there in the mind of God. It's all part of his overarching purpose. The reason I mention this is because he uses that as a description of what goes on in the mind of a human author. The human author is trying to imitate God's total creative act, so that in a good story, there is no accidental byproduct. There's no padding. It's all perfectly worked out.
In a good story, in a great story. And of course, Lewis was surrounded by people who thought about this. There are many authors writing things where that's not really the case.
No.
It's baggier, but Lewis was able to do that, and it's amazing. But these layers of meaning, and it's very helpful to hear this, because my first question when I heard about this discovery, even before I read the book, was how is it possible that decades could go by and that no one would know about this? Because what that implies, obviously, is that Lewis put this in there and never told anyone about it. And that, to me, is just bizarre, because I my personality. If I did anything like that, I would want to share it. I would want to tell the secret to someone, because that to me is the joy of the secret. The idea that he could put layers of meaning, that each of these 7 books has a separate atmosphere corresponding to one of these 7 planets. And by the way, we've got to go down the list, right? The Dawn Treader is all about gold. The sun, it's about the sun.
Silver chair is the moon.
The silver chair, silver, it's about the moon, lunacy. I forget which one. I forget which is Venus.
The Magician's Nephew, all about creativity and beauty and mothers and golden apples and laughter,
golden apples,
sweetness,
right?
All that constellation of qualities.
So the Horse and His Boy is Mercury.
Yep, all about twins and language and running and boxing and theft.
And what is Saturn?
That's the last battle.
The last
which
battle.
is all about the last times, death and disaster and treachery and Father Time. And then we've missed Prince Caspian, which is Mars.
Prince Caspian is all about battles.
Yeah.
I mean, if you saw the movie, it's like, it's nothing but battles. But yeah, so this idea that Lewis does this thing, this outrageous thing, and doesn't tell anyone, that is unthinkable to me. So that was my first question. I thought, how is that possible? How could someone create on this level and then just go off and die and never tell anyone?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the answers is sort of in that word behind us there, Socrates. You know, the Socratic method of teaching asks questions but doesn't supply answers. That's the whole method of Socratic education, isn't it? You lay things out for your pupil. You ask questions. You might even ask slightly leading questions, but you don't ram it down the student's throat. You wait for the student to work it out in his own time. That's exactly what Lewis is doing. And it's very interesting that he was president of the Socratic Club, this debating society here in Oxford, which was a forum of debate between Christians and non-Christians. It wasn't a preaching circle. It wasn't Christians getting up and saying, listen to me, this is what I want you to learn. It was dialogue between Christians and non-Christians so that between them they could sharpen each other's wits and learn from one another. That's very Socratic.
It's still, but I still have to say that, you know, okay, so you kind of throw it out there, you wait for your students to come up with it. Well, he went to his grave and moldered in the grave for 4 decades waiting for his student to come up with it, and you came up with it, and if you hadn't existed, I'm guessing this would have continued to be hidden for decades. This is not the kind of thing that was going to pop up at any minute.
You say that, but actually, as I did my own researches, I discovered that 2 or 3 critics before me had come very, very close to working it out themselves.
You had them killed?
Yeah. No, there was one critic, for instance, who saw something of the lunar aspect of the silver chair. Another critic saw how very saturnine the last battle was.
Really?
A third critic noticed how important Jupiter was as a symbol in Lewis's imagination. But they didn't follow these leads.
Okay, but the silver chair and Jupiter I can get, but the saturnine qualities of the last battle, that doesn't strike me as obvious as the other 2. I mean, that's...
No, but the point is that there were other people who were looking along...
But that's amazing to me that somebody noticed that.
They were looking along similar lines.
What's the most striking thing in the last battle that's saturnine? Because I'm not remembering the details of what...
Well, the most obvious aspect, I suppose, is the fact that Narnia is brought to an end by Father Time. Now, if you read Lewis's scholarly works, you will see him say there, Father Time is based on earlier pictures of Saturn. So Father Time with his scythe, his sickle, and his hourglass, that's mythologically the same character as Saturn. And in fact, I discovered this, this was a marvellous kind of confirmation of the discovery. In the Bodleian Library here in Oxford, there is a manuscript of the Silver Chair, which is where Father Time is introduced.
Yeah.
He doesn't do anything in the Silver Chair, but he's just shown sleeping in the underground cavern.
By the way, that is why Lewis is just greater than great. I mean, the image of Father Time sleeping in the cavern, when I read that, I just thought, it literally doesn't get better than this. This is the height of literature. A scene, an image like that, it just stopped me dead.
Potent image, and he's introducing Father Time so that 3 books later, when Father Time wakes up, the character will have been introduced. But in the typescript of the Silver Chair, The character sleeping in the underground cavern is described as the god Saturn.
Wow.
It's there in the typescript 3 times. Wow. But by the time he came to publish The Silver Chair, he thought, this is making it far too obvious. Let's call this character Father Time. And
I don't want somebody to discover this in my lifetime,
yeah,
let's change it.
Let's bank on people not knowing that Father Time and Saturn are the same character.
When I discovered this, when I found out that this book existed, and what it does is it says to you, as great as Lewis is, he's now that much greater. In other words, I thought that these books were amazing, but now I find out, no, there's a whole other level. It's like finding somebody who's great at chess, and then you find, well, no, they're even greater at 3-dimensional chess. You think, I'm not even equal to appreciate this genius. And so now the world knows, because of this, which you've discovered and written about, that C.S. Lewis's books are that much deeper. They are literature in the greatest sense of literature. And I know that not many people, I'm guessing that not many people have done much with this yet, but the fact that you put it out there, it makes it harder to ignore Lewis, I guess is my point.
Yeah, it does. It shows us that if we were apt to dismiss Narnia as just for the children, some silly little game, some hodgepodge or mishmash, then we laughed too soon. And the joke is on us.
And by the way, so the joke's on J.R.R. Tolkien.
Well, it is, actually, yeah.
Okay, you explain that. Please explain that, because I'm sure not everyone knows.
Lewis read aloud the first few chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to Tolkien.
Up the road here, at the Bird and Baby, no?
Don't know where it happened. Probably not in the pub, actually.
Oh.
They used to share their manuscripts either in Lewis's college rooms or sometimes elsewhere, maybe at his house.
Okay.
It's not clear where that happened. Anyway,
someplace around here.
Someplace around here. And Tolkien disliked what he was hearing.
But that's fascinating. Tolkien did not like the Narnia Chronicles. He didn't. There's something about. I mean, because of course he's creating something quite different in the Lord of the Rings. It's much less on the nose, so to speak. It's much more. What's the word? I don't know.
Implicit,
yes.
embedded.
So he doesn't like Lewis's. Aslan is Christ, and it rubs him the wrong way, and he generally doesn't like it. And maybe the worst thing about the Narnia, about the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the Father Christmas. Is that right?
Yeah, Father Christmas is something he objects to. He just dislikes the whole way in which Lewis draws upon all sorts of different literary traditions.
So that's what I'm saying. So this is his bone to pick with Lewis. He's saying that there's something sloppy and hodgepodgey about this. And the worst example is Father Christmas. What in the world is Father Christmas, a British figure from the 19th century, walking through this thing? You've got all these mythological figures and centaurs, and then you put in Father Christmas. What a mess.
Yeah. Tolkien disliked it intensely.
Right.
And he later confessed that the books were entirely outside his range of imaginative sympathy. And he soon gave up.
Nice way of putting it. I'm going to have to remember that.
He soon gave up trying to read them when the books began to be published. So he didn't actually know them at all well. But he reacted against them, as in fact he reacted against almost everything Lewis wrote. He disliked most of Lewis's works. If you look at Tolkien's letters, almost every time he's referring to a new book that Lewis is publishing, he's finding fault with it. You know, he hated the Screwtape letters, for instance, even though that's dedicated to Tolkien. He found much to object to in Mere Christianity. He refused to review Studies in Words because he said if he reviewed it and said what he really thought about it, it would be the end of his friendship with Jack. He was a hard man to please.
He was a hard man for Lewis to please. I mean, that's amazing.
Well, actually, he was a hard man for almost anyone to please.
But I mean, if Lewis being a dear friend and a genius, and the man that Tolkien led to faith, I would say principally Tolkien was the one who led Lewis to faith. So it's a tremendous connection. And to find out these people that most of us love, that even though they were friends, he didn't like or approve of Lewis's writing, particularly these Narnia books, particularly The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He just had a problem with it. And then, all these years later, it turns out
that he was wrong.
He missed it.
Yeah. Well, on the surface, Tolkien is correct, but on the surface, the books do look like a hodgepodge. And that's why lots of people have, in following Tolkien's view of the stories, have also dismissed them as a mishmash. But you see, that was a bear trap, that was an elephant trap that Lewis was laying for his readers. You asked earlier, why would Lewis conceal it? Why would he go to his grave not telling anybody about it? There's a scriptural verse which says, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it is the glory of the king to reveal the matter. So this goes back to Socrates, actually, that, God doesn't force himself upon us.
Okay, not being God, I want to force one thing upon the audience, because just to make it clear, the figure of Father Christmas in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is there because when you think of Jupiter, when you think of Jove, you think of sort of a kingly Falstaffian figure, maybe, with ruddy cheeks, and Father Christmas is the epitome of that kind of a figure. At least that's one reason that Father Christmas is in the book, yeah?
Yeah.
If you don't know that, it does seem strange. Why is Father Christmas in this book?
And some of Lewis's friends encouraged him to leave Father Christmas out of the book, but before it was even published, they said, he doesn't belong in this story, leave him out. But Lewis was insistent on retaining him, so there must have been some good reason for including him. And the reason is that he sums up one aspect of the jovial symbol, this red-faced, loud-voiced, jolly personality who gives gifts. I mean, that's a major part of the jovial symbol. Lewis used to say in his own university lectures that those born under Jupiter are apt to be loud-voiced, red-faced, and jolly. And then he would pause and add, it is obvious under which planet I was born, because he himself was just like that. The florid face, hearty laugh, great gusto for life. He was jovial himself.
Before we go into the secrecy thing, I just want to say that, so Lewis had a deeper appreciation for what we would call, I think, we would call it astrology, but he had a different appreciation. In other words, when we think of astrology, we think of this kind of new age, strange, fatalistic system, but there is something to it, and Lewis thought there was something to it.
Well, he thought that there was more to the stars and the planets than just their material components.
He thought they were part of God's poetry.
Yeah.
So he did feel that if you're born under Jupiter, that there is a jovial influence on your life.
I don't know that he would go that far.
Okay, so he was joking when he said...
Yeah, that wasn't a serious
Well, that's why
remark.
I'm asking you, because it wasn't...
But he did very seriously believe that it is a mistake to think that when you have told us that Jupiter is made up of so much carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, whatever it may be, that you have explained it in its entirety. Because, I mean, to refer back to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, there's that marvelous exchange when Eustace says to the star character that they've met, in our world, he says, a star is just a huge ball of flaming gas. And the star replies and says, even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of. Now, there, encapsulated in a beautiful, pithy exchange, is a very profound point about reductive materialism.
Which Lewis was the enemy of.
Yes. The stars are actually proclaiming the glory of God. The heavens are telling the glory of God, in the words of Psalm 19, which was Lewis's favourite psalm. The stars are, in their deepest essence, messengers of God's glory and beauty and creativity.
Yeah. That idea is all through the so-called space trilogy. And it's something that, again, it's been lost. The medieval world, Tom Howard, some of you know the great Tom Howard, he wrote a book called Chance or the Dance, or as you would put it, Chance
or Dance.
Or the Dance. And, thank you. And in that book, he talks about this basic idea that sort of the medieval Christian worldview was that everything in the universe is part of God's poetic expression, that everything means everything, that everything is pointing to something else. It's interconnected. It's this dance that we can discover. The chance view, the sort of modern secular materialist view, says nothing means anything. It's just what it is. It has no meaning. It has no resonance. It doesn't say anything. Whatever. Therefore, a human being is just a collection of cells, a collection of atoms, collection of some chemicals. You know, I remember when I was a kid, people would say, like, oh, yeah, a human being is just like $1.98 worth of chemicals that you could buy someplace. You know, today it would be $12. But the point is that that's reductive. That's to say, whereas somebody, I don't know if it was Chesterton, said a human being is a walking poem But that's Lewis's idea, and he brings that worldview to all of his books, and especially to the Narnia books.
Yeah. But I think he was very cleverly sort of presenting the Narnia books as, on the surface, a hodgepodge or a mishmash, without any very obvious pattern or design, so that people would dismiss them.
Okay, that's fascinating. Why do you think, why?
I think it was a deeply laid apologetic strategy, if you ask me. I mean, he was president of the Socratic Club here in Oxford, as I mentioned, and famously he had a debate at that Socratic Club with Elizabeth Anscombe, the philosopher.
Yeah.
She was picking at some holes in Lewis's book Miracles. You've written a book on miracles.
Haven't I? Your copy's here.
But you know, in Miracles, Lewis is arguing for just this thing, that he's arguing against reductive materialism, that there is spiritual reality, there is rationality in the universe. We can understand.
In his book Miracles.
In his book Miracles.
He's arguing, say it again?
He's arguing for a rational spirit that pervades material reality.
Okay, and Anscombe in this famous debate criticizes him on this point?
She's not faulting him on the point. She's faulting him on the expression of the point. She's wanting him to tighten up some of his language. I mean, she was a Christian herself. She wasn't wanting to fault him on his basic conclusions. She's just wanting to make him work a bit harder as a philosopher, because she was a professional philosopher and he wasn't really. So they had this famous debate here in Oxford, and it was the only time that Lewis ever lost a public debate, because it was on a very small little matter where he'd been writing a little bit too casually, and she was able to say, no, you need to correct yourself here. And because he was so rarely wrong-footed even in the slightest, this immediately became a big kind of urban myth in Oxford. Were you at the Socratic last night? Did you hear how Lewis was crushed in debate? She swept the floor with him. You know, it became this big thing, and lots of people kind of let this snowball into a myth about how Lewis was so crushed in this debate that he retreated from philosophical apologetics and withdrew into fantasy for children.
I've heard that many times, and every time I've heard it, it doesn't make sense to me, so I'm glad to have it debunked.
Yeah, but, well, it looks plausible, at least on the chronological scheme, because, you know, this debate happened in February 1948, and the first record we have of him writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in earnest is the fall of that same year, September or October 1948. So there does seem to be a cause and effect. He loses this debate, he starts writing Narnia.
Aren't you glad he lost the debate?
Yeah, I'm delighted. But you see...
Where would you be?
The point is that he's turning to this fairy tale form, not as a retreat from apologetics, but I think as an advance in apologetics, that he's wanting to recast this philosophical argument that he's advanced in Miracles, and he's going to try and tell it poetically, because it's the poets who are the unacknowledged legislators of every age. You turn something into symbols and story and character, and you have an audience for all time, my friend.
That's right.
Whereas apologetic arguments, they come and they go, and they are very time-bound. So it's a brilliant strategy on Lewis's part. Let's make it all into a story. Let's create a story which on the surface looks like a meaningless collocation of atoms, so to speak, but actually there is a hidden design which I, the author, C.S. Lewis, know all about. And one day it will come to light.
But the idea that he had such a long view is amazing to me. I just can't, being an impatient person, the idea that he was willing to sort of lay this down and let it ride for decades, you know, in this case until you came along. Now, what is it? There's something in your book, I can never remember it exactly. I refer to it often and have never looked it up, but you talk about the K factor, the kappa.
Kappa element, yes.
Can you explain that? In other words, it refers to sort of the background atmosphere of a work of literature. Where does the kappa come from?
Well, kappa is the initial letter of the Greek word krypton, meaning cryptic or hidden.
Okay.
So Lewis wrote an essay called The Kappa Element in Romance, the hidden element in stories. And by that, he seems to have meant the all-pervasive flavor or tone of a story, a well-told tale, that never asks to be looked at. It doesn't present itself as an element in the story, but it's the whole story at once. It's the oxygen you breathe within that story. So the example he gives is from The Last of the Mohicans.
Yeah.
And he says, you know, in that story, when the hero of the story, he's half sleeping by his bivouac fire in the woods, and a redskin with a tomahawk is silently creeping up on him from behind. What makes for the essence of the scene, he says, is not simply the fact that the hero is in danger, but that he's in danger from a guy wielding a tomahawk. Now, Fenimore Cooper, the author of the story, could have put a pistol in that chap's hand, and that would have put the hero into greater danger. A pistol is, generally speaking, more dangerous than a tomahawk. But it's not degrees of danger that matter. It's the kind of danger. And the danger represented by a tomahawk is a different kind of danger from the danger represented by a pistol.
It's a more menacing, more primitive.
Yeah.
There's something about it. And that to me, this is what's so fascinating, is that, first of all, the idea that Lewis wrote an essay about this.
Yes.
That's another clue, or actually, no, it's another piece of evidence to say, and therefore you have it in your book. I'd forgotten the detail of Krypton and the essay, but many people, would read your book or hear about this thesis and say, "Oh, it's nonsense." But you put together enough evidence that you make it pretty impossible for somebody to wriggle out of this.
Yeah.
That when you say, "Well, by the way, he did write an essay about this," and here it is. But hiddenness, I think the reason it's so difficult to see is that, and I don't mean the Krypton factor in each book, but I mean the reason the whole thesis wasn't seen for so long is that no one ever talks about this. I've never heard anyone, until Lewis and until your book specifically, I'd never heard anyone talk about the atmosphere of a tale. I'd simply never heard that. Have other people ever spoken about this?
Hardly, and Lewis himself complains about this. He says there are very few critics who are interested in the same kinds of approaches to story that he is interested in. I mean, he names a couple who are not particularly famous, but he is interested in this overarching atmospheric quality of a book. And so to go back to the Last of the Mohicans, the atmosphere of that story is very carefully built up over lots of pages with lots of small elements, all of which conspire to engender the spirit of, you must pardon his 1940s politically incorrect terminology, the spirit of redskinnery.
Is that the word he uses?
Unfortunately.
That's not really, it's not just politically incorrect, it's just ugly.
It's an ugly
redskinnery?
Redskinnery. He gives other examples of books which have this pervasive flavor. Hamlet, for instance, the pervasive flavor of Hamlet is a deathliness.
Deathliness. Yeah, that's right. The black
black cloak,
of his cloak, the skull, Yorick. Okay, but the thing is this. It seems to me that neither Shakespeare nor Cooper were consciously aware of this, whereas Lewis was.
Well, I don't know about that.
But it's a good guess.
Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But the point is that a good artist knows about it at least subconsciously.
But that's what I'm saying. Yeah. It's subconscious, it's instinctive. Yeah. Lewis is the first author, it seems to me, to have made it conscious.
Well,
and deliberate.
I honestly don't know about that.
Well, you may be right about it, but I think it's a very good guess. You have to say that it's probably
certainly as a critic, he's the first or one of the first to bring this to put it on the table as a major element of literary criticism. But he gives other examples of bad books. Like he says, The Three Musketeers is a bad book because it has no weather to it. The characters go from London to Paris, and there's no sense that Paris is any different from London. And that's a very interesting point, that sometimes when he's trying to put into words what he means, he says, we go back to our favourite books many times in the course of a life.
Yeah.
In the same way that we go back and back to our favourite places.
Yeah.
We go back to London for its Londonness.
Yes.
We go back to Donegal for its Donegality. And it's very difficult to put the spirit of a place into words, but you know it when you're there.
It's funny you should say that, because I was thinking of that just the other night, having come here to Oxford. I thought, what is it about this place? And it is exactly that.
Oxford's Oxonianness.
Exactly that. There's something about it that I can't you know, when you think of another place, you think, why do I like places, or what appeals to me about?
Yeah.
But it's something that, I mean, is it possible that only sensitive people feel that? Are there some people who are indifferent to these things? I mean, I don't know, but it seems to me that some people would be more sensitive to it.
There are some. I mean, some authors are insensitive, and so Alexandre Dumas, the author of The Three Musketeers, does seem to be pretty insensitive to it. He doesn't bother to make Paris feel French. It's just a bucket load of plot. You know, it's like those films that you see, which are terribly exciting, full of car chases and explosions.
Right.
But there's no character to the
I think
place.
you've been in one of those films, my friend.
I'm afraid I have.
Well, let me say this, that...
laboratory scene had real atmosphere.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Well, the thing is that I once wrote an essay for Books and Culture about this issue, although I didn't frame it this way, but I was talking about otherness. And this is one of the reasons I love Lewis, is the feeling of otherness, to go to another world. And I was talking, I guess, about Jurassic Park, the first one, and that it begins where you're just excited to see a dinosaur. And somehow you feel, because it was the first time in the history of film that anyone had convincingly, you know, in the early 90s, created a dinosaur that you look at it, it really doesn't look like a stop-action rubber or clay beast, but like the real thing.
Yeah.
And it's just exciting to me. I thought, I just want to go in a movie to another world.
Yeah.
I don't care about the plot. In other words,
Yeah.
the plot to me is incidental. I want to be in another world looking around. And no sooner is that scene over with the dinosaur than Spielberg kind of launches onto this, you know, nitro-burning dragster of a plot that... And the film, to me, loses the beauty of... It's kind of like you're in an Edgar Rice Burroughs world.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to stay there. And that's really what you're talking about. So is it possible that plot is the enemy of this thing? Or somehow?
Well, it is possible. And Lewis does talk about how we have a... He talks about the narrative lust. We want to know what happens next. And we need to be, you know, we need to be excited by the plot,
right,
or else we won't be propelled through
But he's
the
good
story.
at that too.
But yeah, you need to have both. It's
Yeah.
not a question of either or. You need both in a well-told tale. And so he says, you know, what's the point of setting your story on Mars if Mars is not to be used for the atmosphere of the place? You know, you don't just want to transport to Mars a story which might equally have been set in the Bronx. It's got to be a Martian story. And Martianity, he says, must be used atmospherically and emotionally as well as logically.
Wow.
That's the key point. It's all got to conspire.
Yeah.
And that total effect, that, you know, that gestalt, that holistic
Gestalt.
thing.
You know, that's the
Gestalt.
word of the day. You get $50.
Thank you.
Please go to Petty Cash and get him $50. Gestalt.
That holistic effect is the kappa element. It's the Donegality. It's the total imaginative world that you breathe as you enjoy a well-told story. But the important thing is that it's hidden from you effectively by the fact that it is everywhere in the story, because you're not looking at it. You're looking along it.
Like you're looking along a sunbeam.
Yeah.
To refer to Lewis's...
Meditation in a tool shed, which is a key part of my argument, actually.
Actually, do you mind making that argument?
Meditation in a tool shed. That's a short article that he wrote all about two kinds of consciousness that we have. And he pictures himself standing in the darkness of his tool shed. It's a sunny day, but it's dark inside this shed. It's bright outside. And through a crack at the top of the door, he can see a beam of light slanting down. You can see the particles of dust floating in the sunbeam, lights up a patch of the floor. And this is his image of one kind of consciousness that we have, which he calls looking at something, contemplating something from the outside. External knowledge, uninvolved, impersonal, neutral, scientific.
Apollinian.
Probably.
We'll come back to that, because
Okay.
I think... Okay.
Then he shifts his position so that the beam of light isn't any longer falling on the floor, but is now falling directly on his eyeballs, and the whole picture changed. He no longer saw the tool shed, and most importantly of all, he no longer even saw the beam of light, because he now saw along the beam of light, and he saw that which it illuminated, namely the crack at the top of the door, the leaves on the tree waving in the wind outside, and millions of miles away the sun itself. The beam of light vanishes when you are inside it. It's no longer something you see, it's something you see by. And that's a really important point for him theologically too, that Christ is the one by whom we know anything, as well as the one whom we know. Christ is the light of the world, and we can look along Christ, but also look at him.
And what's the famous quote about he's the light by which I see everything? Or
Christianity. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. That's the inscription on his memorial in Westminster Abbey.
Well, that would be a great place to close, except I want to keep talking to you when we have a little more time. My goodness, it's just so rich. Has anyone else written about this idea, this kappa element, this hidden quality in literature? I mean, I'm just amazed by it, because it seems possibly that itself could be his claim to fame as a literary critic, that idea.
Well, he mentions a couple of writers like Maud Bodkin, Caroline Spurgeon. His friend Owen Barfield was quite interested in this too. But Lewis seems to be a bit of a trailblazer, a bit of a pioneer in this area.
It's amazing.
But the interesting thing is that he turns this literary critical interest to theological effect, because he's not just interested in painting a well-told story. He makes it Christian, so that Jupiter in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the total jovial atmosphere of the story, but is incarnated, you might say concentrated, consummated in Aslan himself. So the total spirit of the world is also embodied in the Jesus figure.
The Logos became flesh.
Yes, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word by whom all things were made becomes human in Jesus. And that's exactly what Lewis is trying to do with these spiritual symbols of the planets.
And it just so happens that the lion himself is kingly, obviously, which goes along with the kingliness of Jove, Jupiter.
Yeah.
I hadn't remembered that. But it's so rich.
Yeah.
I'd invited you to Socrates in the City in, 2009 or 10, I can't remember,
like that,
in New York, to speak about this. We didn't do interviews back then, but before that, I introduced you to our mutual friend Norman Stone, and it's my greatest joy that at that lunch, I sort of suggested, Norman, you make documentaries for the BBC. You have done the famous Lewis Shadowlands for the BBC, invented that in 1984, whatever. You'd be perfect to do a documentary version of this Planet Narnia, whatever. Amazingly, he did. Yes. It became the Narnia Code, which is one of the most popular things the BBC has done in recent years. And I am in it. I'm interviewed in it.
Making jokes about Tolkien.
That's where I said Tolkien's a jerk, and I got nasty emails from people. I was joking about that, but I thought it was funny. But I say this just because I'm interested in promulgating this idea. And what has happened since that? I mean, obviously, the Narnia Code on the BBC would have kind of opened some doors. But is anything happening with this? It just seems so exciting to me, and I'm curious. How's it doing?
Well, thank you for introducing me to Norman Stone. Because
I live for things like this. I'm very happy.
That was a really marvellous introduction. It was amazing how the BBC said yes to it so quickly and easily.
Isn't it amazing? Yeah.
But partly because of the documentary, the book has reached a lot more people than it otherwise would have done.
Yeah.
And so I've been getting emails from people all around the world saying, at last, that bone that was out of joint has been set.
Oh.
That it's clicked back into place. That slight oddity, that slight feeling of discomfort I had about Narnia suddenly makes sense. It's all now in focus.
Right.
Because I sensed, they write to me and say, I sensed for years that there was something going on deeper than, could consciously be aware of. And now I see what he's up to. So it's a great pleasure to, someone was going to discover this sooner or later.
Well, you're being very humble, because I think that's a load of nonsense.
Well, no, it's true. It was a godsend. It was a gift. It just fell in my lap one night.
Well, it was a gift from God, nonetheless. He did choose you, and it must be humbling and beautiful.
It is. It's incredibly humbling. I will.
Because you're not that bright.
I do. I know.
We all know.
Seriously, I do.
Yeah. We all know. I spent time with you, and I just realize you know you're not that good. So
It's true. You speak wiselier than you mean, my friend.
no. It's just, but it's beautiful because of course you are, and yet you could be that bright and never have discovered this. It is a gift.
It is a gift.
Somehow
Yeah.
that you're allowed to notice this and then to put it out there.
Yeah. But it's partly because I was myself in that position of feeling discomforted about Narnia. I think there's something going on here. I don't know what it is. That feeling was already inside me and had been for several years before I stumbled across this. That was one thing about the discovery. And the other is that, you know, it was just timely, because people like Philip Pullman were really throwing everything they could at Narnia and Lewis back then. The Narnia books were coming under sustained attack.
Back then, meaning around 2003?
Yeah, late 90s, early 2000s. You know, and so to be able to show, actually Narnia is actually a work of genius, was quite handy in that debate, in that controversy.
So your brilliant book on the subject is kind of a nya at Philip Pullman. And really it is, because the level of genius of Lewis is just so expanded by this understanding. So is there any evidence that he's been taken more seriously by anyone in the Academy since this came out? I mean, I would sort of guess not, because people are so hostile to him and his faith. But I would hope that some honest soul would...
Yeah, no, I think it's... I mean, partly the success of Planet Narnia enabled me to then co-edit the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis. That was the first book that Cambridge University Press had ever published about C.S. Lewis.
Really?
Yeah. It's been part of a general movement towards a more serious appreciation of Lewis, particularly in this country, actually. I think it helped lay the ground for the Westminster Abbey Memorial.
Fantastic.
But, you know, it's all building, it's all cumulative.
Yeah.
You never know where anything's going to lead precisely, but people like Rowan Williams, you know, a very well-respected theologian, is now writing books and articles on C.S. Lewis.
I didn't know that.
He preached the sermon at Westminster Abbey. So that has helped Lewis sort of break out of some of the ghetto that he might have been in.
Well, the Westminster Abbey thing, of course, it's a level of acceptance that is it's huge. And of course, think of the billions who'll see this in America, what we're doing right here. Billions. It is exciting to me, though, to tell a new audience, because obviously the BBC documentary was not seen in the United States, so I'm excited to talk to you about this and to point people to the BBC documentary called The Narnia Code, which is what we're talking about, was on the BBC. And then there's another book, sort of a simpler version of this thesis, simpler than Planet Narnia, and the simpler version is called The Narnia Code. But Planet Narnia is a beautiful book, a really well-written book with illustrations. It's so rich that I would encourage people to get that. And actually, it's here. You can get it, and the author will sign it for you. And if he doesn't sign it for you, I'll sign it for you. So, because I'm so excited about it. I guess this does open up all of Lewis's work. When I read, I remember reading Perelandra and thinking, this is so great. It seems to me a deep injustice that this book is not taught alongside Paradise Lost in every college in the world. I don't understand how, if you're looking at the canon of Western literature, you don't logically, you know, teach Paradise Lost, and then at some point, when you get to the 20th century, teach Perelandra, because they speak to each other, and Perelandra is that good. But you know, people in the world of English literature in the last 50 or so years don't seem to appreciate Lewis anywhere near in the way that he ought to be appreciated. And so your book has made a case for that this is somebody of, you know, such genius, and his oeuvre, I think that's the only word that we can use there, is so rich that it warrants looking at by people who ordinarily would have liked to dismiss him.
Yeah. And it's a privilege to have played a small part in that process. But, I mean, I'm standing on the shoulders of people like Walter Hooper. I'm glad that you're interviewing him this week, because he's the leading Lewis scholar in the world, and without him, there would have been no place for me. So, you know, we all serve one another, and we never know what's going to be the fruit of our labours, do we?
Yeah. No, we don't. I really wonder who'd be reading Lewis if Walter Hooper hadn't done all of the... People wouldn't realize that. They just think that Lewis wrote his stuff, but Walter Hooper carried a lot of water in the 60s and 70s to help Lewis become the Lewis that we know today. Many people would have just maybe not heard of him. But I still hope that more will come of this, that the riches of Lewis will be mined by...
yeah, me too. I'm hopeful that other people will be able to explore some of the classical riches in the Narnia book, because my own classical education is not very good. But Lewis was reading Homer from, the age of 8 and translating Greek plays at 16. He knew his Greek and Roman mythology better by the age of 16 than I will ever know it. And so there are all sorts.
Don't you hate people like that?
I do.
Be honest.
Intensely.
I hate them.
But so a properly educated classicist will come along and see all sorts of things which I've missed, for instance. So there's a lot more work to be done.
So pure ambition, base ambition may drive some grad student into this part of the woods because he says there's gold in them there are hills, and I'm gonna get me some.
Yeah.
Although he'd say that in Latin. I don't know how you say that in Latin. But it is exciting. What are you doing with yourself these days, having scaled this high mountain with that book? What are you working on now?
Well, just 2 days ago, I submitted to a publisher a book of essays that I've edited together, which are which are the proceedings of the Westminster Abbey event and conferences that were held in Cambridge and Oxford that same week. So all the British commemorations and celebrations surrounding the anniversary of Lewis's death back in 2013 are now going to be collected under hardcovers and published later this year. It's going to be called C.S. Lewis at Poets' Corner.
Terrific. Wow, so great. Now, I wonder if we just have a couple of minutes left, if anyone has a question that they want to ask. It doesn't have to be a good question, but does anybody have any questions they want to ask? This always happens. Oh, yes, sir.
What's your favorite Narnia book?
I think The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I was explaining that just this afternoon in a tutorial with a student of mine who bears an uncanny resemblance to the person who asked the question.
Well, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, I would say for sure it is my favorite Narnia book, and I'm curious why. And so therefore I was tremendously, I'm sorry to say, disappointed by the film.
It was awful, wasn't it? Yeah. Horrifically bad.
Yes, the director's in the front row. Just kidding. It was disappointing because to me, again, getting to this K factor, to this atmosphere, I was just dying for that kind of a film.
Yes.
And it doesn't seem Hollywood is capable these days of making films like that. It's sad, but they don't seem to be. But tell us why The Dawn Treader is your favorite of the 7.
Well, some filmmakers are capable of it. I think Pixar, at its best, will make films with atmosphere and quality. Right. They're not just interested in plot.
But we don't want an animated Dawn Treader.
No, we don't. No. I like The Dawn Treader because it's it's set at sea. That's a good thing to begin with.
Okay.
The British are a maritime race, after all, and as an Englishman, I like the idea of going off to sea.
What is that? What is the word for that? It's not the
nautical?
The sea-ness.
The
nautical quality?
The sea factor? I don't know.
Sea factor?
It's got a marvelous succession of episodes and adventures, but it's kind of, you can split the book into 3 parts. The first is all very ordinary and piratical and political and bureaucratic on the lone islands with the ships and the Governor Gumpus, and there's no mention of Aslan in those episodes. It's all sort of thing that Robert Louis Stevenson might have written in Treasure Island or something like that. But then in the middle of the book, it gets more obviously like a fairy tale with dragons and golden hordes and sea serpents and magic pools that turn things to gold. Then in the last section of the book, it becomes almost mystical. It becomes transcendent. You get a taste of heaven, and things are, there's a blinding white light coming from the sun, and this Eucharistic banquet laid every evening, and you get a real sense of otherworldliness. And yet you don't feel you've blundered into 3 separate books. Lewis just gradually builds and moves from one to the next, so that by the end you're under the full meridian blaze of the sun, and it's just a superb success.
And can you imagine we're talking about a children's book?
Yes, I can.
I mean...
Because children's books should not be dismissed.
Well, and of course Lewis wrote an essay about that.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying, is that he's written a book that's, on the one hand, it's a children's book. On the other hand, it's a glorious poem that will last for the ages.
Yes.
I mean, it's something, you know, when you think of a children's book, whatever it would be, I don't want to knock anything. Well, the Bobbsey twins or something like that. Well, I'm saying the Bobbsey, you know, it's about the same length, it's about the same, but
right.
It's like watching, you know, a bad sitcom versus, I don't know, watching a great film comedy or something like that. Yeah. It's just so different. And so the Dawn Treader, on the one hand, it's a children's book. On the other hand, it's a glorious work of literature. Yes. And I can't really think of too much children's literature that reaches in that way.
No, you're right.
The scene at the end of the Dawn Treader, I mean, I love every aspect of it. I think the gold, things turning to gold in the pools. And the funny thing, too, is that you realize that we all become kids when we're reading things like this, because you think, what is it about that I love? It's the same thing that as a kid, you just love hidden, you know, staircases and trap doors or whatever it is. There's something that we respond to, and Lewis gets that. But then when you get to the last part, and for those of you who haven't read it or read it recently, you have this beautiful ship going farther and farther eastward. And the sea begins to be covered with lilies. And that image of endless white lilies, a sea of endless, that's a poetic image that no one can top that, period. End of sentence. No one can top that. To equal that would be, you know, it's a lifetime's goal.
And the sea becomes sweet and drinkable. And when they pour buckets of this seawater down their throats, it's like drinking light, they say.
Okay, I was going to say that, it's like drinking light.
Yeah.
I just want to stop and just adore. It's such a beautiful image. It's such a powerful, unique image that they're drinking this like they're drinking light, and then it in turn has this effect on them when they drink this seawater, which is like drinking light, that they're able to take in more light. When they look at the sun, they don't go like this, which is an image of sanctification.
Yes, absolutely.
This idea that the more we become like God, the more we can behold him. The more we don't go like this, get away from me, you're destroying me. Right. It becomes less like hell, more like purgatory, more like heaven. The closer we get, you don't expect the evangelicals to throw in purgatory, do you, Mr. Roman Catholic? But of course, I'm more a mere Christian than an evangelical, as you know. So, but it seems to me that kind of progression, sanctification, that they're getting closer and closer to heaven, and you can feel it in the book. It becomes more and more beautiful, and it's just it's an incredible ending. I mean, it's just spectacular.
But it's partly because I think the whole book is designed out of the symbolism of the sun, the solar influences, which are gold and illumination and wisdom and profundity, and the sun is the heaven of philosophers and theologians, Lewis says. And so Aslan is the light of the world. He's seen flying in the sunbeam.
Right.
He is the one in whom the other characters gradually grow up and participate. So when they're drinking light, they are effectively drinking in the Christ character. Yeah. So it's all a beautifully coherent image of, you know, spiritual growth and identification with the Christ character. It's not just, you know, a magical image. It's got profound wisdom in it, too.
Well, the Orthodox would call it theosis, right?
Divinization.
And then my favorite part is right at the end, Reepicheep, the noblest character, gets into, I don't know if it's a coracle or some kind of a small boat, and leaves the ship. He's going to go off on his own because they come to the end of the sea at the end of the world. And there's, what is it? There's sort of a wave at the end, and he decides to go into Aslan's country, which means that he's sort of going off the edge of the world, the edge of this world. And he rows by himself this little coracle, this little, like a dinghy, smaller than a dinghy, uphill. Think of that. Just stop. He's rowing uphill because the water is static at the end of the way. I mean, these images are without peer in literature. They're that great.
Yeah.
And so you've, I think, helped people to begin to see Lewis as that great. Yeah. And when he says, I don't remember what he says when he says goodbye, but he's bidding adieu to his dearest friends that he's been with on this adventure, and he's rowing into heaven. Mm. And it's one of the most moving things I've ever read. Mm. And it's at the end of a children's story called The Dawn Treader.
Yeah. It's about a mouse.
about a mouse with a sword.
And it's crazy at one level, isn't it? But it just shows the genius of a true poet at another.
I mean, wow, it is great. And so go out and at least buy a copy of The Dawn Treader and read it and reread it. But it's that great. Mm. It's that great. Well, do you understand why this thesis is so amazing and why the idea that people haven't known it is just crazy? I just am so stunned that God allowed you to do this, and through you allows all of us to appreciate this level of C.S. Lewis. It is just huge. I can't tell you if there's anything else that we want to touch on.
Well, one question that people often ask is, is it believable that Lewis should not have told Tolkien?
Yeah, okay.
That's a valid question.
Yeah.
But why should Lewis have told Tolkien? Why should he have told anybody? Because the whole point of this design is that it is meant to be received by our imaginations, not by our intellects. We are not really meant to look at it as we read the stories. We are meant to look along it. We are meant to inhabit it. So for Lewis to have told anybody about it would have been to frustrate the very thing he was trying to achieve.
Yes and no, because then that would make your writing about it sort of vulgar.
Well, no, it wouldn't. No, that is also a good question, but
okay.
That is the obvious next question. Haven't I just frustrated the thing that Lewis is trying to achieve? But I'm a literary critic. I'm not the author of the stories. It's the literary critic's job to explain what the author is up to.
Wouldn't it have been delicious for him to write a book about this under a pen name and never tell anyone? See, that's what he ought to have done.
Well, maybe he has.
Maybe if he lived,
maybe Walter Hooper is sitting on the document.
Wow.
We'll reveal it tomorrow.
Well, one final thing, actually. Well, finish your thought.
Well, the point is that Lewis himself was a literary critic and unpicked Dante and Chaucer and Spenser in minute detail.
Yes.
Not as an end in itself, but so that readers could better understand what these authors were about, so that when they next read the poem or the play or whatever it was, they would get more out of it. And that's what my book is about. I'm not proposing this explanation as an end in itself. It's meant to be a service to the reader so that they will enjoy Narnia Chronicles better next time they read them. They'll be able to put more in, so they'll get more out.
But is there any reason Lewis couldn't have done that himself?
Yeah, because he's the author. You can't be the author and the critic at the same time.
But he's also a literary critic. I think
but not of the same work at the same time. You can't both be in the stalls and on the stage at the same time. You've got to choose one or the other.
He could have done it in an oblique way.
Well, he did. He left some clues.
He left some clues.
Alrighty
then, and you picked up those clues, and here we are. Bob's your uncle.
Yeah.
Well, one final thing is that you say some things in these books about Lewis's penchant for secrecy. That's something that I hadn't realized until I read your book, and I realized that, he got married to someone and didn't tell his friends. By the way, there's a wonderful biography of Joy.
Just out.
Did you know it? It's just coming out next month. I've read it. It's wonderful.
It's an amazing book. Yeah.
But so all this wonderful stuff is coming out. But this idea that, I don't know if there's anything to add to that, but that he really was into puzzles and into secrecy.
Yeah.
Not in a nefarious way, but it was something that he prized.
Yes.
So that kind of explains how it's possible he kept this a secret.
Absolutely. His last novel, Till We Have Faces, is all about the hiddenness of the divine. That nothing that's beautiful hides its face, nothing that's honest hides its name.
Yeah.
So says the deluded, selfish character at the heart of the story, and she's utterly wrong. She realizes that God is a God who hides himself, and that Jesus taught in parables deliberately to keep it from those who are forever seeing and not beholding, ever hearing and not understanding. Spiritual things are spiritually discerned. And that's an important lesson for us all to learn, that, we can't expect to click our fingers and work it all out. We've got to want it. And we've got to love, and it's love that is the great opener of eyes. That, I think, is an important part of the reason for Lewis keeping it secret, that he's teaching us that lesson as well.
Wow, well, we will end there. Folks, it's probably appropriate to give a warm Socrates in the City, Oxford thank you to our guest, Dr. Michael Ward.